County 911.
Beaver County 911.
Beaver County 911.
Beaver County 911.
Beaver County 911, what is your emergency?
USAir 427, Pittsburgh. USAir 427, Pittsburgh. USAir 427, radar contact lost.
Please dispatch.
Yes, I'm calling off of the expressway. We just saw an airplane crash.
All right, ma'am, do you know, is it a commercial aircraft?
Yes, it looked like a USAir jet. It went straight down.
Beaver County 911.
Yes, hi. There's just been an airplane crash, as far as I know, up on Green Gardens Plaza.
September 8, 1994, Chicago. 127 passengers and 5 crew members arrive at Chicago's O'Hare International Airport, set to board USAir Flight 427, bound for Pittsburgh. They are set to board a Boeing 737-300, November 513 Alpha uniform, one of the newest airplanes in USAir's fleet. The flight crew consisted of Captain Peter Germano, 45, who was hired by USAir in February 1981, and First Officer Charles B. Chuck Emmett III, 38, who was hired in February 1987. Both were regarded as excellent pilots and were very experienced. At 4:50 p.m., USAir Flight 427 departed from Chicago. The 55-minute flight to Pittsburgh was smooth and uneventful with pleasant weather along the route. On approach into Pittsburgh that evening, USAir Flight 427 was sequenced behind a Delta Airlines Boeing 727. The aircraft experienced some light jostling, and First Officer Emmett tapped on the right rudder pedal in response. Suddenly, and without warning, Flight 427 rolled onto its back and began a nosedive into the ground, crashing near the Green Gardens Plaza, just a few miles from its final destination of Pittsburgh International Airport.
Again, if you have just joined us, a USAir 737 has gone down with reportedly 123 people on board in Hopewell Township, Pennsylvania, in Beaver County, just northeast of Pittsburgh.
And we were like one of the first people up there. When we got there, there was people running back there like crazy, trying to see if we could help. But all we seen was body parts hanging from the trees and just people everywhere.
USAir had already been in the news far too much over the past decade. Flight 427 was the carrier's 6th accident in 8 years. Some of these accidents were not the fault of the airline. On February 1, 1991, USAir Flight 1493 was cleared to land at Los Angeles International Airport. However, the controller forgot that she had cleared SkyWest Airlines Flight 5569 to enter the runway. In the dark, the USAir pilots could not see the SkyWest airplane on the runway. The 737 landed on top of the Metroliner and skidded into a building, causing the loss of 35 people. And just 3 months before Flight 427, USAir Flight 1016 crashed while on approach into Charlotte, North Carolina, killing 37 people. That accident was attributed to wind shear. In response to growing criticism of the airline and to the accidents, USAir pilots had began a program called Operation Restore Confidence, designed to look into and improve pilot and maintenance proficiency to try to prevent another accident. The company got its start in 1939 as All-American Aviation, founded by the DuPont brothers and headquartered in Pittsburgh. It changed its name to Allegheny Airlines, with routes primarily located in the eastern U.S. The airline enjoyed a good reputation during this time and began a series of acquisitions in the 1970s and 1980s. 2 notable airlines that were acquired by Allegheny were Pacific Southwest Airlines and Piedmont. However, 4 fatal accidents in 5 years had shattered the public's confidence in USAir, and the findings of the Flight 427 accident would have a lasting impact on commercial aviation that is still being felt to this day. The sight greeting NTSB investigators and first responders was gruesome. For the first time in history, an air crash scene was declared a biohazard, and investigators were forced to wear full-body suits as they searched through the debris. At USAir's headquarters in Virginia, workers were scrambling to put together the passenger list so they could identify who was on board and to begin the process of notifying families. News was already trickling out worldwide, and frantic family members began calling USAir asking for information about their families, while the airline had no information to give them. Things were different in 1994. It was possible for someone to buy an airline ticket, but then give that ticket to someone else. For USAir, the airline did not want to call someone's family and let them know that their loved one was gone, only to later find out that person was not on USAir 427. It was a logistical nightmare, and all hands were on deck, from management to customer service reps to flight crews, unprepared for the magnitude of the situation to try to put the pieces together.
While he was on that phone call at like 1 in the morning, he paused and he stopped and he turned and looked at my mom and I and said he was on that plane. And
for the NTSB, it seemed like history was repeating itself. On March 3, 1991, United Airlines Flight 585, another Boeing 737 on approach to Colorado Springs, suddenly rolled over and crashed in a field, killing all on board. The investigators had tried everything, but 3 years later, no conclusive evidence had been found to determine the cause. For the investigators, it was like chasing a ghost. The Boeing 737 is one of the most popular aircraft ever built, with thousands of them flying every moment of every day. It truly was, and is, the backbone of commercial aviation. First flying in 1967 as a small regional airliner, the aircraft at this point in its second generation had enjoyed thousands of sales and a strong safety record. One of the design breakthroughs for the aircraft was a dual servo valve in its rudder. Designed as its own failsafe, the servo valve had 2 slides moving back and forth, powered by hydraulic fluid, powered by a power control unit, PCU, to move the enormous rudder. If one slide were to fail, the other slide would be able to move the rudder. Filters were installed to prevent any debris from damaging the sides. On both flights, tiny metal chips were found floating in the hydraulic fluid, but the manufacturer, Parker Hannifin and Boeing, convinced investigators that filters would protect the servo valves. To their credit, microscopic investigation had revealed no scratches in the metal, and to the investigators' frustration, the PCU and servo valve for USAir 427 was found intact. In post-accident testing, the 427 unit performs perfectly. It performed so well that it would actually pass all certification and could be installed in another 737 if needed. For the families, the nightmare had hit another level. Boeing and Parker, convinced that their design was not the cause, blamed the pilots. USAir blamed Boeing. For the families, they were caught in the middle of it. Hundreds of court cases were filed against the airline and manufacturers.
There was so much information being discussed, so many different theories being thrown around at that time. And as you can imagine, people were, they were starved for information.
Back at the crash site, NTSB investigators were still combing through the debris looking for clues. However, they could not shake the feeling that USAir Flight 427 and the earlier crash of United Airlines 585 were related. In fact, they seemed to be mirror images of each other. United 585 rolled to the right, while USAir 427 rolled to the left. The only difference was the weather. For the United crash, strong wind rotors over the mountains were considered a potential cause. But the weather was perfect for USAir. Investigators needed to get to the bottom of this, or the most popular airplane fleet in the world may be a ticking time bomb, just waiting to go off. NTSB investigators decided to take a bold and potentially life-threatening gamble. They chartered a USAir Boeing 737, identical to the one that crashed, and flew it back and forth behind the wake of a Boeing 727 to see if that could have had any impact on the flight.
And the airplane would come out of the wake and regain its composure and fly on with no problems. There's no reason to lose control of the airplane.
one of the lead investigators made a very, very good observation, and that was that if the wake of a 727 could cause the loss of control of a 737, we'd have 737s falling out of the sky weekly or more.
Investigators zeroed in on Flight 427's rotation, or yawing to the left, just moments before the pilots lost control.
We knew the airplane yawed. And the question was, what would cause that? And it quickly became apparent that the only device that could make the airplane yaw the way it did is the rudder. That's what it's designed for.
There were a couple of people on the airplane that were very heavy, and someone said, well, what would happen if the floor gave way and a passenger stepped on a control cable? Could that have done it?
And so we did a test, and that quickly became obvious that that event couldn't happen. The amount of weight required was too great. So we looked at all kinds of bizarre potential failures. You name it, everything was considered, and one by one we eliminated them.
We felt confident that there was a rudder issue, but we didn't know what it was. There's something going on back on the tail of the airplane we don't understand. I had described it as a gremlin that left no marks, that left no calling card.
One more thing considered was a potential pilot suicide. The flight data recorder showed that First Officer Emmett kept his rudder pedal pressed hard to the floor in the moments leading up to the crash. However, analysis of the CDR confirmed that both pilots were in a good state of mind and doing everything possible to arrest the roll. But without any evidence to rule out a parts failure, investigators were left stumped. For family members, the grief had to turn to anger and frustration as the crash investigation rolled into its second and third year. Without answers as to the cause, family members began demanding access to Flight 427's debris being brought to a hangar in Pittsburgh. NTSB policy at the time was not to allow families access, but the families were convinced that seeing the debris might help bring closure to the loss of their loved ones. They sorted through bins of debris, looking for any personal belongings that might have belonged to their loved ones. They found some. In outrage, some turned to lawyers for assistance while others organized petitions on Capitol Hill. The families began the Flight 427 Air Disaster Support League to begin to come together and make a difference. And then the unthinkable almost happened. On June 9, 1996, on final approach into Richmond, Virginia, Eastwind Airlines Flight 517 experienced several uncommanded rollover events.
And so you have two pilots shoving with all their might on a rudder pedal, and all it's doing is driving them back. It keeps pushing back at them. It doesn't go forward. We've never had this report from a crew before of a pedal back forcing against them. Now we're into a different scenario.
Fortunately, they were at a higher airspeed than 427, which gave them more roll control. They were able to successfully land the airplane.
After hearing the pilot's testimony and examining the rudder system on the Eastwind 737, investigators turned their attention back to the PCU units on USAir 427 and United 585, looking for something that might explain the behavior felt by the Eastwind crew.
Dual servo valve from a power control unit. The pilot inputs go into the arms here, and just by moving back and forth across these openings, it would redirect the fluid.
In the end, the NTSB found that the servo valve had not only jammed, but reversed. While no physical evidence was ever found, the investigators ran the PCU through a torture test, freezing it in dry ice and then pumping hot hydraulic fluid through it. Many in the FAA and Boeing rejected the findings, but engineers running through the data could see that the rudder valve had actually reversed.
Jammed the secondary valve just slightly off neutral. You could cause the valves to basically misalign and port hydraulic fluid in the wrong direction, so the rudder reversed operation. And this would be like driving your car, and you turn to the left and the car goes right. You're never going to figure this out before you go off the road.
The final report on USAir 427, which occurred in September 1994, did not come out until March of 1999.
Hard to believe it was 30 years ago. It's still so vivid in my mind. I remember the evening. I remember the time. It was shocking. Pittsburgh had never seen anything like it before.
Poor First Officer Chuck Emmett pushed hard on his right rudder pedal, trying to arrest the left roll. What he could never have known was at that moment the valve had reversed, and that by pushing hard on the right rudder, The valve in the rudder was holding the rudder over to the left. The PCU and servo valve on the Boeing 737 was redesigned, and Boeing spent nearly $1 billion replacing the part on all 737s flying around the world. However, bad blood between USAir and Boeing ran over, and the airline never ordered another Boeing aircraft as long as it flew. After USAir 427, the carrier wanted to improve its relations with the consumer. On March 1, 1997, in order to show its status as a truly global carrier, the company rebranded itself as US Airways and brought a new stylized livery into the fold. Like many carriers, it was heavily impacted by the events of September 11, 2001. It filed for bankruptcy twice in the early 2000s and closed its longtime hub at Pittsburgh. It also merged with America West Airlines and took on that carrier's call sign of Cactus. It even briefly considered a merger with struggling carrier United Airlines. On January 15, 2009, US Airways was involved in a near disaster as Flight 1549 landed on the Hudson River in New York City. The miracle on the Hudson can trace its origins back to the efforts of the USAir pilots in the early 90s. However, in 2013, the company merged with American Airlines and flew its last flight in 2015. Like other fallen carriers, USAir has left quite a mark on aviation history. However, its darkest day still casts its shadow over commercial aviation today. USAir flew on after Flight 427, but for the families, life would never be the same. The airline's insurance company had created formulas to calculate the worth of each passenger for a financial settlement. Some families took the settlement, but others wanted to shame Boeing and the airline for all of the finger-pointing during the investigation. USAir's lawyers asked all kinds of questions: the strength of their marriage, household chores, even diving into their sex life. One family member even wanted to bring a full-sized USAir 737 tail section to the trial to drive the point home. But for Brett Van Bortel, it came down to a coin flip. He wanted to take care of his children and set up a scholarship in his wife Joan's honor. Heads, he would sue. Tails, he would take the settlement. Maybe it was fate, or maybe it was a message from up above. But the coin landed tails, and the case was over. The NTSB investigators were horrified to learn that there was no real plan for taking care of the families of those lost in an air disaster. Signed into law by President Clinton in 1996, the Aviation Disaster Family Assistance Act directs the NTSB to coordinate all federal government resources to support local, state, and tribal governments, disaster relief organizations, and the air carrier to meet the needs of families after aviation disaster. In the end, it was the families of Flight 427 that made the biggest difference. By petitioning for government assistance, they ensured that future air disaster victims' families would be taken care of. The Boeing 737 went out to great success in the 90s and 2000s and evolved through 2 more generations without any more rudder hard-over incidents. Flight crews received new training to counteract flight control issues. But with the recent issues with the Boeing 737 MAX, Boeing is once again under the microscope. However, while USAir may be gone, but the Boeing 737 lives on, made safer by the hard work of the NTSB, and all involved to bring justice to those who lost loved ones on that beautiful yet gruesome September evening in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.